Damon Graves never told anyone when he was coming home. That morning in Chicago, the man who controlled half the underground operations on the East Coast returned from New York earlier than expected. He'd just sealed a deal worth tens of millions, the kind that made him untouchable in a world where power was the only currency that mattered. But none of it settled the hollow ache sitting behind his ribs. His Gold Coast mansion stood quiet against the gray skyline, elegant, immaculate, and empty in ways that had nothing to do with furniture. He came through the door, the way he moved through everything, silent, calculated, unseen. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe proof of something he'd been feeling for weeks but couldn't bring himself to face. Since Naomi's death 2 years ago, a bullet that was meant for him but found her instead on the I-90 expressway, he'd poured every waking hour into the empire. His twin daughters, Lily Rose and Josie, were 3 years old and had been raised almost entirely by Haley Brennan, the 27-year-old housekeeper he'd hired and never once looked at twice. He paid for the best doctors, the tightest security, the most expensive toys, but he never paid with the one thing they actually needed. That morning, he stopped just before the kitchen. A soft voice, then a voice that broke, then nothing. He pushed the door open slowly, and what he saw nailed him to the floor. In the middle of the wide kitchen, flooded with pale morning light from the windows overlooking Lake Michigan, Haley was on her knees. Faded jeans, white shirt rolled to the elbows, hair pulled back loose, cleaning solution still on her fingers. Across from her, also kneeling, were his daughters. Tiny bodies sitting straight, small hands pressed together, eyes squeezed shut. They were praying. But it wasn't the praying that gutted him, it was what they were saying. God, please keep Daddy from being sad. That was Josie, struggling with words too big for her mouth. Lily Rose squeezed her fingers until her knuckles went white. Please don't let Daddy leave again. I get scared he won't come back. Haley's eyes were closed, tears sliding down her face without a sound. Damon felt something crack open in his chest that no amount of money or violence had ever reached. His little girls weren't asking for toys. They weren't asking for anything a man like him knew how to give. They were asking for him. And then Haley whispered the sentence that destroyed him. Lord, if I could give them what they're missing, I'd give everything I have, but only you can fill this kind of empty. He stepped back like a man who'd just been told the one truth he'd spent 2 years running from. No advisor, no enforcer, no doctor had ever said it this clearly. His daughters weren't broken. They were alone. If this story's already doing something to you, hit like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Damon couldn't sleep. He lay on the king-size bed in the primary bedroom, a room larger than most Chicago residents' entire apartments, eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. But what he saw wasn't plaster or molding. It was the faces of his 2 little girls with their eyes squeezed shut in prayer. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he got up and crossed the long hallway of the Gold Coast mansion barefoot, the motion sensor lights flicking on and off with each step as if the house itself were breathing in time with his unease. He moved slowly, without a destination, letting his feet choose for him. On both walls hung photographs in dark walnut frames, each one a milestone the outside world called success. He shook hands with an Illinois state senator at a fundraising party. He stood, cutting the ribbon at the opening of a casino in Atlantic City, his smile sharp as a blade. He was on the cover of Forbes under a headline that named him the new generation king of real estate. He sat beside the mayor of Chicago at a winter charity gala, 2 champagne flutes touching beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier. But among the dozens of photos stretching down that hallway nearly 30 meters long, there wasn't a single one of him holding his daughters. Not a single one with Lily Rose, not a single one with Josie. He stopped in front of the last frame, a black and white photo of him standing before the Graves Holdings headquarters on opening day, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the camera with that cold confidence the media like to call unbeatable. He stared at the man in the photo for a long time and, for the first time, he didn't recognize himself. He went into his office. The room even Reed had to knock on 3 times before he was allowed inside. On the black oak desk, resting under the soft yellow glow of the lamp, lay a loaded 9mm Beretta, 3 land deal files waiting for his signature, 2 thick, unsealed cash envelopes, a second phone used only for calls that were never meant to be recorded, and an invitation to a private dinner with a federal congressman at the weekend. That was the surface of his life. Guns, money, power, secrets. He sat down, picked up one file, then let it slip from his fingers. Not because it didn't matter, but because Lily Rose's voice was still echoing inside his skull, begging him not to go, telling him she was scared he wouldn't come back. He leaned into the chair, closed his eyes, and memory crashed over him without permission. 2 years earlier, a November afternoon, Interstate 90 on the outskirts of Chicago, Naomi had been driving the black Mercedes home after picking up the girls from the pediatrician. The sniper's bullet went through the windshield on the driver's side, clean, precise, professional. It wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at him. But at the last minute that day, he'd switched cars with his wife because his own was in for maintenance. Naomi died on the spot. Lily Rose and Josie sat strapped into their car seats in the back. Not a scratch on them, but their faces were smeared with their mother's blood. Damon hunted down the man who'd ordered the hit for 3 months and ended it with his own hands in an abandoned warehouse on the south side of the city. Blood for blood, but blood couldn't fill an emptiness. After the funeral, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He became more efficient, colder, more ruthless. He expanded his empire, swallowed rivals whole, tightened every relationship with a cord of fear. He turned into a machine, and machines didn't need to come home and hold their children. He'd always told himself he was doing everything for Lily Rose and Josie, for their future, for their safety, so no one would ever dare touch the Graves family again. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, he wondered if that was true, or if it was just an excuse he'd built to run from a house that still carried Naomi's perfume in the closet, to run from 2 pairs of eyes that looked exactly like their mother's, eyes that watched him each morning with hope and then disappointment, to run from the truth that he, the man who made an entire city afraid, was afraid to sit beside his own daughters because he didn't know what to say. He bent forward, covering his face with both hands. He wasn't sad. What he felt went deeper than sadness, heavier than sadness, and was far harder to swallow than sadness. He was ashamed. The smell of freshly brewed coffee pulled him out of the chair in his office, where he'd been sitting all night. Early morning light slipped through the tall panes of glass and laid a pale gold wash over the staircase as Damon walked down, slower than usual, heavier than usual. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. From the kitchen came laughter, the kind of laughter he'd heard hundreds of times from a distance but had never been close enough to feel its warmth. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked in. Haley was sitting on the kitchen floor with the 2 girls, the 3 of them forming a circle around a brightly colored wooden-shaped puzzle. Josie held a star piece and was trying to force it into a round slot, her face scrunched up with concentration. Lily Rose sat pressed close to Haley, one hand steadying a piece, the other gripping Haley's sleeve as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground. When Damon stepped in, all 3 looked up at once. There was a brief moment of silence, the kind of silence that happens when someone familiar enters and yet their presence feels unusual. Josie reacted first. She dropped the puzzle piece, stood up on legs that still wobbled a little, and ran to him. "Daddy." She wrapped her arms around his leg, pressed her face to his knee, and Damon caught the scent of warm milk mixed with baby soap in her soft hair. A simple, ordinary smell, belonging to ordinary mornings he'd missed hundreds of times. He bent down and lifted her. Josie was so light he almost couldn't feel her weight in his arms. But the real heaviness was in the way she clung to his neck, tight and timid at the same time, as if she was afraid that if she held on too long he'd set her down and disappear. Lily Rose came over much more slowly. She was always the one who watched before she acted, so much like him that sometimes looking at her made him uncomfortable, like staring into a mirror. She stopped a few steps away, tipped her chin up with blue-gray eyes identical to Naomi's, and asked in a small, careful voice, as if she'd asked this question too many times and had gotten used to only one answer. "You're leaving today, right?" It wasn't a question. It was almost a statement. Damon felt the words slice across his chest, cleaner than any knife he'd ever held. Haley lowered her face, pretending to rearrange the puzzle, but her fingers were trembling slightly. Damon drew in a deep breath, the kind of breath he used before walking into a negotiation where lives were on the line. But this time there was no opponent across the table, only a 3-year-old girl waiting for her father to say goodbye like he always did. "No, princess. I'm staying home today." Lily Rose didn't smile. She didn't run in for a hug. She just looked at him for a few more seconds, as if weighing whether she should believe him, then turned and sat back down beside Haley. Damon pulled out his phone and typed a short message to read. "Postpone everything. I'm not going anywhere today." The phone began vibrating non-stop within seconds. Messages piling in from Reed, from his assistant, from nameless numbers in his contacts, where every missed call could mean millions of dollars or a life. He flipped the phone face down on the marble countertop and sat down on the kitchen floor beside the girls. He tried to do something he didn't know how to do. He sat there, fitting pieces together with them, listening to Josie's imagination spill out in a story with no beginning or end about a cat that could fly, and to Lily Rose's serious explanation of why the star piece didn't fit the circle, because the star liked being alone. He laughed without looking at the clock, but the closer he stayed, the more he began to notice the details his absence had hidden for 2 years. Josie never looked him straight in the eye when she spoke, her gaze always slightly lowered or sliding toward Haley first, as if asking permission. Lily Rose, whenever she startled at a loud sound, turned toward Haley instead of toward him, her tiny hand reaching for the housekeeper's sleeve by reflex. Both girls, before doing anything at all, grabbing another puzzle piece, reaching for a cup of water, or even laughing too loudly, glanced at Haley first, searching for a nod, a smile that allowed it, a signal that everything was all right. Not at him. Never at him. And Damon understood it wasn't rejection. It was habit. They'd gotten used to him not being here. They'd built an entire, small, safe world around Haley, because she was the only one who always stayed. And realizing that, realizing his daughters didn't hate him and had simply learned how to live without needing him, hurt more than any bullet he'd ever taken. By midday, both Josie and Lily Rose had drifted off on the soft fur rug in the living room. 2 small bodies curled into each other like a pair of parentheses, their breathing even and gentle in the mansion's unusually quiet air. Damon stood watching them sleep for a long time, then stepped out into the backyard. The garden was wide, trimmed to perfection by a landscaping crew that came twice a week, the green lawn stretching all the way to a 3-meter-tall iron fence that wrapped the entire property. He stopped beside a white iron table under the canopy of a massive oak and called Haley out. She came carefully, wiping her hands on the cloth towel draped over her shoulder, moving with the posture of someone used to keeping a safe distance from her employer. She halted about 2 meters from him, close enough to hear every word, far enough to feel comfortable, and waited. "Mr. Graves, what do you need?" Damon didn't answer right away. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. Not the quick glance of a powerful man acknowledging an employee's existence, but the look of a father trying to understand who had kept his daughters intact while he was gone. Haley Brennan was 27 years old, thinner than most people should be, hands roughened from working since childhood, dark brown eyes carrying a fatigue that had seeped into bone, and yet also carrying a patience he couldn't find in anyone in his organization. She'd left West Virginia and come to Chicago alone at 23, leaving her younger brother Jonah with Aunt Ruth, sending money home every month without missing a dollar, never complaining, never asking for a raise, never asking why her employer was never home. "I heard you last night." Haley went rigid. Her eyes widened just a fraction, and Damon recognized it as fear. Not fear of losing her job, but fear that she'd crossed a line she'd drawn for herself the day she first stepped into this house. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean anything inappropriate. I was just trying." He cut her off with a quiet voice, quieter than any voice he'd ever used inside these walls. "Thank you." Haley stared at him like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Damon swallowed. Something lodged in his throat, but he forced it into words. "Thank you for taking care of what I neglected." Silence sat heavy between them. Wind off Lake Michigan moved through the fence with a bite of cold. Haley lowered her gaze for a moment, then said, her voice steady but each word weighed carefully, as if she knew she'd have only one chance to tell this man the truth without being thrown out the front door before nightfall. "With all due respect, Mr. Graves, the girls don't need more toys. They've got everything money can buy. But what keeps them safest isn't good doctors or tall fences or guards at the gate. What keeps them safest is knowing you'll come back." The sentence hung in the midday air like something with its own weight. Damon didn't respond. He only stood there, letting every word sink in. And when Haley turned and went back inside, he still hadn't moved. That afternoon, when the girls woke up and ran to the playroom on the second floor, Damon followed. He'd never been inside that room for more than a few seconds, usually just standing in the doorway, looking in, then turning away. But today he stepped fully inside, and what he saw on the wall opposite the window made him stop short. A crayon drawing taped up with clear tape, the kind a 3-year-old makes, scribbled, out of proportion, but cruelly clear. In the center was an adult figure with long hair, smiling, carefully colored in, standing between two smaller figures holding hands. That was Haley. On either side were Lily Rose and Josie, and in the far right corner, tiny, almost pressed against the edge of the paper, was another figure. No smile. In its hand was a long black object a child would draw from imagination. But Damon knew exactly what it was. A gun. The little girl didn't understand what a gun was, but she knew her father held something frightening, and she knew her father was always very far away. He stood in front of the drawing for a long time. His arms hung at his sides, and he felt something inside his chest, something he'd armored for 2 years, beginning to crack, slowly, second by second, as he stared at that tiny figure in the corner of the page. He'd built an empire the entire city feared, but in his daughter's eyes, he was only a small shadow holding something scary, standing at the edge of their lives. That night he didn't go anywhere, not to his office, not to call anyone, not to check his messages. He sat on the playroom floor, his back against the wall directly beneath the drawing, while Lily Rose and Josie took turns bringing him toys to show him. Josie hugged a stuffed bear with worn ears and explained that its name was Mr. Cloud because it was soft like a cloud. Lily Rose brought over a picture book and turned each page for him, serious as if she were giving a presentation, pointing to each image and saying, "This is a fish, this is a house, this is the sun." Damon listened without thinking about any deal, without thinking about casinos or shipments or the calls that came at midnight. For the first time in 2 years, the only thing filling his mind was time, and the truth that he'd wasted too much of it. Haley stood outside the playroom doorway, her shoulder leaning against the frame, watching in silence. She didn't step in. She didn't say a word. But there were 2 things living in her eyes at once, 2 things that contradicted each other. One was hope. Hope that the man sitting on the floor would stay long enough that the girls wouldn't have to pray one more time. The other was fear, because Haley had lived in this house long enough to know Damon Graves's world was a world where softness wasn't allowed to exist, and anyone who showed it became a target. The next morning, Damon's phone vibrated at 8 o'clock. Reed Calloway's name flashed on the screen, and Damon knew it wasn't a wellness check. He stepped out onto the second-floor balcony, slid the glass door shut behind him so his voice wouldn't carry into the house, and answered. Reed's voice was low, fast, straight to the point in the way of a man used to handling crises before the sun came up. The money laundering deal through the Atlantic City casino chain, tens of millions of dollars sitting in the conversion phase, and the partner on the other side was demanding to see Damon in person in New York within 48 hours to sign off. No fax, no calls, no intermediaries, face-to-face or the deal was dead. Reed added, his tone dropping another half-step. The syndicate in Miami had smelled blood. They knew you didn't show up in New York last week. They're approaching our partner. And Vince. Vince is talking to people he shouldn't be talking to. If you don't go, you don't just lose money, you lose control. Damon listened to every word. Every sentence made sense. Every argument was right, according to every principle he'd lived by for 20 years in the underworld. Money was blood. Power was oxygen. Losing control meant death. He understood all of it. But while Reed was talking, Damon's eyes dropped through the balcony glass to the garden below. Haley was pushing the small swing hanging under the oak tree. Josie sat on the swing, legs kicking, head tipped back, mouth wide in laughter that made no sound because the wind swallowed it. Lily Rose stood beside them, both hands wrapped tight around the chain of the next swing, waiting for her turn. Eyes lifted to Haley with the quiet patience of a child who'd learned how to wait. Haley pushed gently, steady and even, one hand supporting Josie's back, her mouth moving as she said something Damon couldn't hear from the second floor. But he saw Lily Rose smile. Wind off Lake Michigan blew Haley's hair across her face, and she brushed it aside with the back of her hand, never stopping the motion of the swing. It was a scene so ordinary anyone looking in would think it was nothing special. But to Damon, standing on the balcony of a mansion he'd bought with dirty money, listening to his closest advisor explain that his empire was starting to wobble, that scene was the only thing that felt real. And in his head, Lily Rose's voice from the morning before last rose again, begging him not to go, telling him she was afraid he wouldn't come back. Reed was still talking. Damon cut him off. "I'm not going." Silence on the other end. Not the kind of silence that meant agreement. The kind of silence that meant someone trying to confirm they hadn't misheard. "Damon, do you understand what I'm telling you? Tens of millions. 48 hours. If you don't show, they'll take it as weakness. Vince is waiting for this exact opening. I heard you, and I'm not going." Reed didn't say anything else. He'd known Damon long enough to understand that when his voice dropped to that level, there wasn't an argument on earth that could change the decision. The call ended. Damon stayed on the balcony for a few more minutes, phone clenched in his hand, looking down at the garden. He was scared, truly scared. Not the fear he'd grown used to facing in dark alleys and tense boardrooms, but a stranger kind of fear, fear that the choice he'd just made would bring down everything he'd built his entire life. But at the same time, threaded through that fear was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of a man who'd won, but the peace of a man who, for the first time, knew he was standing in the right place. He went down the stairs and out into the yard. Josie saw him from far away, jumped off the swing and ran to him on tiny mud-streaked legs, holding a scribbled drawing she'd been coloring all morning. "Daddy, I drew this for you." He bent to take the paper. On it were 4 stick figures standing side by side. This time no one was pushed into a far corner. No one was holding anything frightening. Everyone was in the middle. Lily Rose walked over from the swing, not running, still with that careful step that was so uniquely hers. But this time, she didn't stop 2 steps away. She came straight to him and wrapped her arms around his leg, cheek pressed to his knee, saying nothing. Damon stood there in the garden, one hand holding the messy drawing, the other resting on Lily Rose's head, and he understood that the real price wasn't losing tens of millions of dollars. The real price was losing this moment. 48 hours after the call with Reed, the storm hit. Not in the Chicago sky, but inside the empire Damon Graves had spent 20 years building. The first blow landed at 9 o'clock in the morning on day 1. The Atlantic City partner pulled out of the casino agreement. No renegotiation, no extension. Just a short call from their attorney stating that the memorandum was no longer valid and that all funds in the conversion phase would be frozen until further notice. Tens of millions of dollars vanished inside one polite sentence. The second blow came that afternoon. A weapons shipment transiting through the port of Newark was stopped by federal customs while it was being loaded into an export container. There was no sign it had been a targeted operation planned in advance. It was simply the absence of direct coordination from Damon, a broken link in communications, a transfer order issued at the wrong time, a recipient on the other end not confirmed by procedure. It was the kind of mistake that never happened when Damon had his hands on the wheel, and that was exactly why it sent a clearer signal than any news report ever could. The boss was losing focus. The third blow arrived on the morning of day 2. Cash flow from 3 shell businesses in Chicago went to the wrong account. The chief accountant called Reed in a panic because the misdirected amount was large enough to trigger automatic bank alerts. Reed managed it, but the crack was showing, and Vince Talon, the man who'd been waiting for this exact moment, began to move. He didn't do anything loud. He didn't announce himself. He didn't threaten. He didn't confront anyone head-on. He just talked. A private dinner with the Southside Chicago capo. A coffee meeting with the handler of the Milwaukee line. A long call with an old partner in Detroit. And in every conversation, Vince said only one thing, dressed in different words. The boss is losing control. Nobody knew what was happening inside the Gold Coast house. But in the underworld, rumors didn't need truth to spread. They only needed doubt. And Vince planted doubt the way a gardener plants seeds. Patient, steady, knowing that with time alone it would grow. 15 miles away, inside an office with no nameplate on the 11th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago, Special Agent Colleen Park sat before 3 computer monitors, and for the first time in 5 years of tracking the Graves file, she saw what she'd been waiting for. A crack. The shipment seized in Newark, the misdirected cash flow, the casino deal collapsing. Each event on its own could be explained, but 3 events in 48 hours couldn't. She picked up the phone and called her assistant. "Turn up the pressure on Kensington. Tell him the window is open and it won't stay open forever." Judge Arthur Kensington, who'd been in the pocket of the Graves syndicate for more than a decade, began receiving denser calls from the FBI, each one ending with the same reminder: cooperate now or go down with them. Outside, Damon's world was fracturing from 2 sides, internal and legal. But inside the Gold Coast mansion, something else was happening. That evening at dinner, Lily Rose reached for her glass of milk and knocked it over. White milk spread across the dark wooden table, ran to the edge, and dripped onto the floor. She froze, eyes wide as she stared at the spill, then looked up at him with fear. The kind of fear no 3-year-old should have just because she spilled a glass of milk. Haley stood in the kitchen with a towel in her hand, ready to rush over and clean it by reflex, but she stopped. She stayed still, watching Damon, waiting. Damon didn't call for anyone. He took a paper towel from the table, pulled his chair closer to Lily Rose, and started wiping it up with her. "It's okay," he said softly, the voice of a man who'd ordered people killed with a single nod, now soothing a 3-year-old girl over spilled milk. "Sometimes things spill." Lily Rose looked at him, then at the paper towel in her father's hand. Then she began to wipe too. From the other end of the table, Josie giggled at the way the milk made a little stream on the floor. Haley stood in the kitchen, towel still in her hand. But she didn't come closer. She only watched Damon's hands. Hands she'd seen wrapped around a Beretta on his office desk. Hands she knew had done things that couldn't be spoken aloud, now gently wiping spilled milk beside his daughter. It was a tiny moment, meaningless to anyone watching from the outside. But to 2 children who'd grown used to their father being a shadow in the far corner of a drawing, it was bigger than an empire. That night, after the girls fell asleep, Damon went up to the playroom alone. He stood before the old drawing on the wall, the one where he was tiny in the corner holding something frightening. He took a black crayon from the girls' box of supplies and slowly drew a thick, bold line connecting the figure of him in the far corner to the 2 figures of his daughters in the center. He wasn't an artist. The line was clumsy, shaky, uneven, but it was a beginning. Vince Talon wasn't the kind of man who attacked head-on. He was the kind who stabbed you in the back with a smile, and in the week that followed the collapse of the Atlantic City deal, he moved through every link in the Graves organization like an illness that spread slowly but couldn't be stopped. Tuesday dinner with Polly Drennan, the boss of West Chicago, at an Italian restaurant in Little Italy that the Graves syndicate quietly owned. Vince didn't say anything heavy. He just told it like an offhand side story that the boss had canceled his New York trip to stay home and play puzzles with the kids, and that he was letting the housekeeper tell him what to do. Polly laughed, but his eyes didn't. Thursday lunch with the Kowalski brothers, who ran the shipping line through Milwaukee. Vince shared a sincere concern that he was worried about the organization because leadership was letting personal emotions affect decisions worth tens of millions of dollars. Friday night call with an old partner in Detroit. Vince mentioned that maybe it was time the organization reevaluated its leadership structure to ensure stability for everyone. Reevaluated its leadership structure. In the underworld's language, that was the polite way to say a vote of no confidence. And a vote of no confidence in Damon Graves's world wasn't losing a chair in a boardroom. It was losing everything, including the ability to protect the people who carried the Graves name. Reed reported to Damon every night with short calls, his tone steady but the strain sharpening a little more each day. Vince is building an alliance, not strong enough to flip the table yet, but growing. At the same time, on the other side of the line, Special Agent Colleen Park achieved the breakthrough she'd been waiting for 5 years. Judge Arthur Kensington, after a string of increasingly dense pressure calls from the FBI, finally sat down at the negotiating table. He hadn't confessed to anything specific, but the simple fact that he'd agreed to meet was enough for Park to know the wall was cracking. She ordered her team to expand financial surveillance across the entire network of shell companies tied to Graves Holdings. The new surveillance order was signed. The net tightened another notch, and Damon didn't know it yet. Then on Saturday night, Damon's phone rang with a number he rarely saw appear. His father, Frank Graves, 65 years old, retired in a mansion in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the sun shone 300 days a year, and the old man spent most of his time playing golf with men who'd laundered money for cartels in the 80s. Frank wasn't calling to ask about his granddaughters. He never asked about his granddaughters. I read Reed's report. Frank's voice was cold and dry as the desert he lived in. "What the hell are you doing?" Damon stood in the bedroom with the door shut and the lights off, looking out the window at the distant blinking of Chicago night lights. "I'm rearranging my priorities." Frank gave a snort, the kind of laugh Damon had heard his entire life, and it always carried the same message. "You're weak, and weakness gets you killed. Graves men don't let feelings run the show. Your mother wanted me home more too. I didn't listen, and I'm still standing here." The words hit Damon not because they were wrong, but because they were familiar. He'd heard them in 100 different forms since he was a 10-year-old boy sitting in the bleachers of a school ball field, staring down at the empty seat where his father had promised he'd be. He'd lived with them through dinners alone, while his parents' arguments leaked through the next room, because his father had missed another birthday, another recital, another promise. He'd swallowed it and let it become the spine of every decision he'd made for 2 decades. Feelings were weakness. Presence was a luxury. A man proved love with money, not time. But tonight, for the first time, Damon didn't swallow. Mom died alone in the hospital while you were in Vegas negotiating. Silence. The kind of silence heavier than any threat Damon had ever spoken in his life. He heard Frank's breathing grow louder through the phone. 1 beat, 2 beats, then the long tone of a hang-up. Frank ended the call. Damon lowered the phone and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Margaret Graves, his mother, had died of pancreatic cancer 12 years earlier at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix. She'd been there for the last 3 weeks of her life. Frank visited 4 times, never more than 30 minutes each, because there was always a call, always a deal, always something more important than the woman who'd lived beside him for 40 years. The night she died, Frank was in Las Vegas negotiating the transfer of a hotel. He got the news by phone, went quiet for 15 seconds, then told the man across from him, "We continue." And now he was calling his son and saying he was still standing here, as if that were proof of being right instead of proof of what he'd lost. Damon sat in the dark for a long time. He understood the war he was fighting wasn't only with Vince Talon, not only with the FBI, not only with a shaking empire. The biggest war was with something that had been passed through blood from father to son, the belief that a man proved his worth by being absent for things bigger than family. And he was trying to break it. But breaking a legacy hurt far more than breaking an empire ever could. The next day, Damon left the house at dawn to meet Reed at a discreet coffee shop in the West Loop, the organization often used for exchanges they didn't want to leave a trace of. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Reed laid out the entire picture in front of him. The list of people Vince had met, the calls he'd made, the promises he'd scattered, and the estimated financial damage from losing the Atlantic City deal combined with the shipment stopped in Newark. The numbers weren't enough to kill the empire, but they were enough to make it bleed. And in the underworld, the smell of blood drew vultures faster than anything else. Reed didn't tell him to go back to the old rhythm. Reed never told him what to do, but the way he placed each number on the table, slow, exact, without emotion, was the way of a man saying, "Look at it, decide for yourself, but look closely." When Damon drove home in the late afternoon, he was exhausted in a way no sleep could fix. Not tired from lack of rest. Tired from holding 2 worlds apart so they wouldn't crush each other while both demanded he choose. He parked in the garage, slipped into the house through the back door, light as a shadow, a habit the underworld had carved into his bones. And when he got close to the kitchen doorway, he heard it again, a small voice. His eyes shut by reflex, his back pressed to the hallway wall, and he stood there listening. "Dear God, help Daddy because Daddy is very sad. Josie," her voice was still baby thick, still straining to push out words too heavy for her tiny mouth. But this time something was different. Last time she'd prayed that Daddy wouldn't be sad. This time she knew Daddy was sad. Not guessing, knowing. Then Lily Rose's voice, clearer, slower, each word pronounced carefully as if she'd been thinking about it for a long time before she said it. "Please don't let Daddy be scared." Scared. The word went through the wall, through skin and muscle, through the armor he'd spent 20 years building, and struck the thing he'd hidden best, because he was scared. Truly scared. Not scared of Vince. Not scared of the FBI. Not scared of losing money. Scared he wasn't capable of being both a father and a boss, that this world had no space for both, and he'd have to choose one and lose the other. But what nearly stole his breath wasn't that his daughters were praying. It was that they could feel it. He hadn't told them a single thing about work, about pressure, about Vince, about numbers falling into freefall. He kept everything behind his office door, behind midnight calls, behind the calm face he wore at every dinner. But children didn't listen with their ears. They listened with something deeper. They felt every tremor in his voice, every flicker of a frown, every time he held them while his body stayed rigid, every time he smiled and his eyes didn't follow. Physical presence wasn't enough. He was in the house, but they still knew he wasn't really here. Haley opened her eyes and saw him standing outside the doorway. She didn't say anything, didn't move, didn't interrupt the prayer. The two of them looked at each other through the kitchen frame in a short moment where everything was bare. No distance of employer and housekeeper. Only 2 adults who both knew the 2 little girls kneeling between them needed more than either of them had been able to give. That night, Damon didn't go into his bedroom. He went out back and sat on the white iron chair under the oak tree, staring at the Chicago skyline cutting across the night. Willis Tower glowed. The Tribune Tower shone faintly. Beyond that were millions of lights from a city that never slept, and he sat here, in the garden of a mansion worth tens of millions of dollars, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt. He thought about selling everything, walking away from the organization, moving the money into trusts for the girls, disappearing into a small town where nobody knew the grave's name. Then he thought about returning to the old rhythm, flying to New York tomorrow morning, calling the partner back, tightening the organization, crushing Vince, proving to everyone that he was still the man they should fear. Both choices had logic. Both were easier than what he was trying to do, because what he was trying to do, balancing two worlds, was something no one in the Graves bloodline had ever managed. His father hadn't managed it. His grandfather hadn't managed it. And for the first time, Damon wondered if it was impossible, or if nobody had ever dared to try. His phone vibrated. A message from Reed, short as always. Vince has someone watching Haley. Black car, fake plates, parked outside the mansion for 2 straight days. Damon read the message twice. The first time, his blood boiled with the instinct of a man defending territory. The second time, something colder replaced instinct, calculation. Vince wasn't watching Haley because she was dangerous. He was watching her because he knew she mattered, and if Vince knew she mattered, then she'd become a target. Damon called Reed, his voice dropping to the level that anyone in the organization would recognize as an order that wasn't allowed to fail. Protect Haley and her brother Jonah, 24/7. Don't let her know. Don't let anyone but you know. Reed didn't ask why. He only said, understood. The call ended. Damon stayed in the garden a long time, the Chicago sky darkening, the wind turning colder. But he didn't go inside. He was thinking about Haley, not as the housekeeper, not as the childcare, but as the person keeping everything he had from falling apart, and he'd just realized he was willing to protect her with the same ruthlessness he'd used to protect his empire. The thought made him stop, because it meant she wasn't only an employee anymore. Later, when the whole house was asleep, he went up to the playroom again. He stood before the drawing on the wall, the one he'd added the thick connecting line to a few nights earlier. He took the crayon, and this time he didn't draw a line. He drew himself again. Bigger, closer, no longer stuck in the far corner, right beside his 2 daughters, in the middle of the page, in the place he should have been from the beginning. It wasn't art. It was a vow. The days that followed held nothing dramatic inside the Gold Coast mansion, and it was that lack of drama that mattered most. Josie stopped crying in the middle of the night. Before, she used to wake up around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, crying without sound, curled under her blanket and not calling for anyone because she'd gotten used to nobody coming, until Haley heard the faint sniffling through the baby monitor and ran in to hold her back to sleep. But this week, Josie slept through the night. Haley noticed it before Damon did. She checked the monitor each morning, and for the first time saw the girl's sleep graph run flat from 8 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Lily Rose changed in a different way. She started inviting her father to play. Not the way Josie ran to wrap her arms around his leg by instinct, but the way Lily Rose stood beside him with a book or a doll and said in a small but clear voice, "Daddy, will you play with me?" There was no trembling question mark at the end. No glance toward Haley asking permission. Just a simple invitation from a 3-year-old who was beginning to believe Daddy would say yes, and Damon always said yes. Saturday morning arrived with an unusual quiet. There was no phone vibrating at dawn because Damon had given Reed an order. Saturdays and Sundays, unless someone is dead, don't call. Early October, sunlight poured through the large windows and warmed the kitchen in a soft gold. Haley had been up since 6 o'clock, wearing an old gray sweater, hair tied high, standing at the stove pouring pancake batter onto the pan. The smell of hot butter and vanilla filled the first floor. Josie and Lily Rose sat in their high chairs by the counter, legs swinging, eyes fixed on the pancakes puffing up in the pan like they were watching magic. When Damon came down the stairs, all 3 looked up, but this time there was no awkward pause. Josie waved. "Daddy," Haley made bare pancakes. Lily Rose pointed at the pancake on her plate. "I have ears, Daddy." Damon watched Haley at the stove, her apron dusted with flour, a smear of butter on her cheek she didn't know was there, flipping pancakes with practiced hands. She turned, gave a brief smile, then said, "I'll set the table for you in the dining room if you'd like." Damon shook his head. "Don't clean anything today. Sit and eat with us." Haley froze, spatula still in her hand, staring at him like she needed to confirm she'd heard right. In the 2 years she'd worked in this house, she'd never once sat at the table with her employer. She cooked, she cleaned, she served, and then she ate alone in the kitchen after everyone was finished. That was the boundary. That was the rule. Nobody had written it down, but everyone understood it. But that morning, Damon pulled out another chair beside the dining table, the long 6-seat oak table where normally he sat at one end, the girls sat at the other, and Haley stood between them serving. 4 chairs, 4 plates, 4 glasses of orange juice. For the first time, the Graves Mansion dining table had no empty space. Haley sat down carefully, her back still a little straighter than usual, hands resting in her lap, not fully relaxed but present. Josie started talking about an imaginary dog named Bong. She said Bong lived under the bed and only came out when Daddy was home because Bong was scared when Daddy left too. Lily Rose listened to her sister, then turned to Damon, her voice quieter, more serious. Last night I dreamed about Mommy. The table went quiet. Haley lowered her eyes. Damon swallowed. Did Mommy say anything, Princess? Mommy didn't say anything. Mommy just smiled. Then Mommy disappeared. Damon didn't know what to say. He only put his hand on Lily Rose's head and left it there, longer than usual, and she didn't pull away. Then, in the middle of breakfast, while Josie was trying to reach for more syrup and Haley was cutting Lily Rose's pancake into smaller pieces, Lily Rose looked up at Damon and said something he wasn't ready to hear. Daddy, you're not far away anymore. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Coming from a 3-year-old, it carried the weight of a pardon. Damon felt something turn inside his chest, like a key finding the right lock after years of trying the wrong ones. He didn't speak. He only nodded. But under the table his hand curled into a fist, because he didn't want anyone to see his eyes getting wet. That afternoon, after the girls took their nap, Damon went into his office and did things that a month ago he would have called insane. He called the dealer about the Lamborghini Urus he'd bought last year just to leave in the garage, and he told them the car was for sale. He called the private members club on the Magnificent Mile, where he'd paid a 6-figure annual fee but hadn't set foot once in 18 months, and he canceled his membership. He called Reed and proposed something he knew would shake the organization, a shared leadership model. Reed would take on more direct operational authority. The regional bosses would have greater decision power within their own territories, and Damon would step back into a strategic role instead of controlling every detail. Reed was silent for 15 seconds before he said, "Some people will resist." Damon replied, "I know, but I also know some people will support it because they're exhausted too." And he was right. When Reed began sounding people out over the next week, the reaction wasn't as uniformly hostile as expected. Polly Drennan, the man Vince had been whispering to, unexpectedly said he didn't object if the West Side got more autonomy. The Kowalski brothers in Milwaukee admitted the old model was burning people out. Someone even told Reed bluntly, "If the boss has found a way to run this without anyone selling their soul, I'm listening." Not everyone agreed. Vince certainly didn't. But for the first time, Damon's decision wasn't being seen only through suspicion. It was opening conversations nobody had dared to start before. One Sunday afternoon, while Josie and Lily Rose were napping in their room, Damon stepped onto the second-floor balcony to breathe and saw Haley sitting alone on the white iron chair in the garden. She was hunched forward, both hands wrapped around her phone, her shoulders trembling slightly. He almost turned back inside, because his instinct was always to stay far from other people's feelings. But this time his feet carried him down the stairs instead of away. He walked into the yard and stopped a few steps from her, close enough that she'd know he was there, far enough not to press. Haley looked up, quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to hide the redness along her nose. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm just resting for a minute and I'll go back in right away." Damon didn't answer that. Instead, he asked a question he hadn't asked once in the 2 years she'd worked in this house. "Is something wrong?" Haley looked at him, weighing truth against the boundary she'd drawn for herself from her first day here. Then, maybe because she was tired, maybe because the last few weeks had blurred the line between employer and the man she'd started to trust, she said it. "My little brother. He misses me." Damon sat in the chair across from her. "Tell me." And Haley told him, for the first time, not like an employee reporting to her boss, but like someone who'd been carrying a burden too long and had finally been allowed to set it down, if only for a few minutes. Jonah, 9 years old, her little brother. The boy had severe asthma since he was small, the kind where every flare could turn into an emergency if the right medicine wasn't there in time. He lived with Aunt Ruth in a small town in Appalachia, West Virginia, where the coal mine had closed long ago and most residents lived below the federal poverty line. Aunt Ruth was 58, with chronic back pain, working part-time as a cashier at the only grocery store in town, and her wages weren't enough to buy Jonah's asthma medication every month. Haley sent money home steadily, cut her personal spending down to the bone to make sure Jonah had inhalers, had medicine, had basic health insurance. Their father had left when Haley was 12, without a word, without a call, leaving only an empty closet and car keys on the kitchen table. Their mother died of lung cancer when Haley was 19, and from that day on, Haley became everything to Jonah. Sister, mother, father, lifeline. But she was in Chicago, and he was in West Virginia, more than 500 miles away, and every night when she video called, Jonah asked the same question, "When are you coming home?" Damon listened without interrupting. He listened about a skinny 9-year-old boy living in an old wooden house, wheezing whenever the weather turned cold. Missing his sister so much he drew Haley on every school worksheet, and he realized the woman sitting across from him, the woman he'd only known as someone who mopped floors and cared for his children, was carrying a pain that ran parallel to his. She was absent from the life of the person she loved most, too. She was paying in distance, too. The only difference was she didn't have tens of millions of dollars. She only had roughened hands and the paycheck he gave her each month. "Bring him here." Haley lifted her head, eyes still wet. Damon said it again, his voice not softer than usual, still the voice of an order, but something else ran underneath it that both of them could hear. "Bring him to Chicago. Let him stay here. This is your home, too." The word home slipped out of his mouth before he could think, and the moment it landed in the air between them, Damon felt its weight. He didn't say, "This is where you work." He didn't say, "This is my mansion." He said, "Home." Haley's eyes widened slightly, her lips moving but no sound coming. "I don't want to be a burden, Mr. Graves." "He's not a burden." He didn't explain further. There was nothing to explain. 4 days later, on a flight from Charleston, West Virginia to O'Hare International, Jonah Brennan walked out through arrivals with a Spider-Man backpack worn at the straps and sneakers rubbed thin at the heels. A 9-year-old boy, skinny, collarbones sharp under an oversized t-shirt, wide eyes taking in everything with the guarded look of a child who'd grown up too fast. When the car brought him to the Gold Coast mansion, Jonah stopped at the tall iron gate and looked at the house with an expression Damon recognized instantly, the look of someone who didn't believe he was allowed to be somewhere that beautiful. Jonah stepped inside, holding tight to Haley's hand, staring at everything like he was inside a fairy tale palace. Lily Rose and Josie stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the strange boy appear in their territory. Josie tilted her head to study him. Lily Rose kept her distance, that habit of observing before acting still intact. There was an awkward silence, the kind that only happens between children who don't yet know how to play together. Then Josie, always the one who acted before thinking, ran into the playroom, grabbed a red plastic ball, and threw it toward Jonah. He caught it, threw it back. Josie laughed. Lily Rose took one step closer. Then the three of them ran into the yard, their laughter blending together, the ball bouncing across the green lawn in the October afternoon sun, and in 10 minutes every distance evaporated in the way only children could do. Damon stood on the second-floor balcony watching. 3 children chased each other around the oak tree. Haley sat on the back steps, watching her brother laugh with tears running down her face, and Damon thought of something so simple, he couldn't understand how it had taken him years to see it. Love doesn't get divided when you add someone. It multiplies. The asthma attack hit at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd day since Jonah arrived in Chicago. There was no warning. He'd fallen asleep normally after a day of running around the yard with Lily Rose and Josie, his body healthily tired, his breathing steady. Then the October night air in Chicago dropped lower, colder than any night he'd ever lived through in West Virginia, and his lungs reacted. The wheeze began small, like a whistle far away. Then it grew. Then Jonah jerked upright in bed, both hands clutching his chest, his mouth opening to gulp air that wouldn't come in deep enough. Haley heard it through the baby monitor. She burst out of her room, barefoot on cold wood, and ran into the living room where Jonah was sleeping on the pull-out sofa. She snapped on the light and saw her brother. Pale face, lips tinged blue, chest pumping fast but shallow, eyes wide with terror. "Sis, I can't breathe." Haley dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking as she dug through her bag for the albuterol inhaler. She always carried it, but tonight her hands turned each pocket, and couldn't find it. Not because it wasn't there, but because panic was blurring her sight and her fingers wouldn't obey. She dumped everything onto the floor. Wallet, phone, tissues, keys, but still no inhaler. It's in the bathroom. She'd set it on the bathroom shelf this afternoon after Jonah used it, she remembered, but her legs didn't want to leave her brother. Heavy footsteps came down the stairs. Damon appeared in the living room doorway, eyes swollen from being woken up but fully alert in a single second. The instinct of a man who'd lived in a world where any strange sound after midnight could be a deadly threat. He looked at Jonah, looked at Haley kneeling on the floor amid the spilled contents, and he didn't ask what happened. He walked straight in, bent down, and lifted Jonah into his arms. The boy was frighteningly light. Damon could feel ribs through the thin pajama fabric, and the boy's breath pressed against his chest sounded like sandpaper scraping wood. To the car. Now. Haley ran after him, the inhaler in her hand now, grabbed from the bathroom. She gave Jonah 2 puffs while Damon carried him into the garage. He laid the boy in the back seat. Haley climbed in beside him and held her brother, and Damon drove the black Range Rover out through the mansion gate at a speed that turned Chicago's streetlights into blurred streaks across the glass. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 12 minutes from the Gold Coast if you followed traffic laws. Damon made it in 7. The emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning was lit in cold white, smelled of disinfectant, filled with steady beeps. Jonah was taken in immediately. Oxygen mask, pulse oximeter, a nurse checking his heart rate. Haley stood beside the bed, one hand gripping Jonah's hand, the other digging into the bed rail, her eyes never leaving his face. Damon stood behind her. The space was tight, the white light stripping everything bare. And at some point in the waiting, while they both watched Jonah's chest rise and fall beneath the oxygen mask and prayed in silence, Haley's shoulder brushed Damon's. She didn't pull away. He didn't step back. It was only 2 shoulders touching in an emergency room at 2 in the morning. But it was the first physical contact between them in 2 years, and they both knew it. 45 minutes later, the doctor confirmed Jonah was stable. A severe attack, but treated in time. He needed to be monitored overnight. Haley exhaled, the kind of breath that made her whole body sag with it. And tears fell not from sadness, but from relief. Because her brother was still here, still breathing, still looking at her with wide eyes and saying in a hoarse voice through the oxygen mask, "Sis, I'm okay." Damon stood by the doorway, watching the 2 of them, and he spoke quietly but clearly enough for Haley to hear. "I'll cover all of his medical costs. All of it. Medicine, specialists, insurance, everything." Haley turned to him, eyes wet, brow slightly furrowed. "Why?" Damon went silent. Not because he didn't have an answer, because the real answer was growing inside him in a way he didn't yet know how to name, and he was afraid that if he said it now it would become real, and real meant it could be lost. A few days later, when Jonah had recovered and was back to running around with Lily Rose and Josie, as if the emergency night had never happened, Damon came home earlier than usual. He entered through the back door, silent as always, and from the hallway, he heard noise from the living room. Not crying, not arguing, play acting. He moved closer and looked through the doorway. The 3 children stood in the middle of the living room, each holding a doll or a stuffed animal, performing a play they'd invented. Josie held Mr. Cloud the teddy bear, with a sock pulled over its head like a hat, and declared in a booming voice, "This is Superhero Daddy. Superhero Daddy stays home to protect everyone." Lily Rose held a blonde doll and said in a solemn voice, "And this is Star Mommy. Mommy is in the sky looking down, and Mommy is happy because Daddy is home." Jonah, still with a faint wheeze, held a toy car and said, "And I'm the brave kid. I'm not scared because Superhero Daddy is here." Josie set Mr. Cloud in the center of the room and added, her voice proud, "Superhero Daddy doesn't need to fly far away." Lily Rose nodded and added something Damon wasn't ready to hear, "Because you don't need to fly far to be strong." Damon stood in the doorway, his back against the wooden frame, and he didn't move. He just stood there listening to 3 children tell a story about a version of him they were starting to trust, a version that stayed, a version that protected with presence instead of a gun, a version that was strong because he remained, not because he left. Haley stepped out from the kitchen and stopped a few steps from him, and she saw him at the doorway. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him held something deeper than respect, deeper than gratitude. It was understanding. Understanding that the man standing there, the man the world called a boss, was being rewritten from the beginning by 3 children. The article dropped on Monday morning on a financial news site that covered Chicago's upper crust, a site the underworld read almost as much as the business world did. The headline never said his name, but everyone in the organization knew exactly who it meant. An anonymous source inside a leading East Coast real estate conglomerate claimed the leader was going through a severe period of personal instability that was affecting decision-making, and the piece used the phrase, emotional leadership, as if it were a disease that needed diagnosis. Damon read it in his office at 7 o'clock in the morning, before the children woke up. He didn't have to guess who the source was. Only one person in the organization had both the motive and the media connections to leak something like this while keeping a clean, innocent mask. Vince Talon. Over the next 48 hours, the article spread like fire. Social media started speculating, not about the Mafia, because on the surface Graves Holdings was still a legitimate real estate empire, but the underworld read between the lines. Competitors moved immediately. A Miami syndicate Damon had forced out of the Atlantic City market 2 years earlier began reaching back out to his old partners with new offers. 2 major real estate clients delayed signing contracts. The official reason was additional due diligence. The real reason was they were waiting to see who would still be sitting in the highest chair after the storm. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, Vince made his official strike. He sent a request through Reed, by the book, in the right language, polite to the point of cruelty, an organization-wide internal meeting to evaluate the leadership structure and ensure stability for all stakeholders. Evaluate the leadership structure. Damon heard the phrase for the second time, and this time it wasn't rumor anymore. It was an ultimatum. Reed met Damon that night in the mansion office. The door shut tight, the light a pale gold, no recording. Reed didn't circle it. You need to understand the situation clearly. Vince doesn't just want your seat, he wants all of it. And if you lose this vote, you won't just lose leadership, you could lose your life. Vince isn't the kind of man who shares power. He's the kind who replaces completely. Damon looked at Reed, the man who'd stood beside him and his father for more than 2 decades, the man who'd never exaggerated and never held back. If Reed said you could lose your life, it wasn't rhetoric. It was an intelligence assessment. But the threat wasn't only coming from inside. 15 miles away, inside the Dirksen Federal Building, Special Agent Colleen Park was sitting across from Judge Arthur Kensington in a windowless interview room. Kensington, who'd kept quiet for more than a decade, was finally talking. Not because his conscience had awakened, but because he was 70 years old, and the prospect of dying in prison wasn't as appealing as the prospect of finishing his remaining years in witness protection. He hadn't said everything yet, but what he'd said was enough for Park to begin building a RICO case, the federal statute that allowed prosecutors to charge an entire criminal organization as an entity, rather than just individuals. If the case came together, it wouldn't only be Damon. Every regional boss, every accountant, every lawyer in the Graves network could be swept in. Park knew she needed more time and more evidence, but the crack inside the organization was giving her exactly what she needed: chaos. When enemies tore each other apart, investigators only had to wait. Damon Graves was being boxed in from 2 directions, and neither side knew about the other. The inside wanted to overthrow him. The law wanted to cage him, and he was sitting in his office, in the Gold Coast mansion, hearing the children's laughter drift up from downstairs, understanding that every decision he made from this point on wouldn't only shape an empire, it would shape 3 children, and the woman waiting for him to come down the stairs for dinner. On the morning of the meeting, Damon woke before his alarm. He lay still for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of the city beginning to wake. He thought about what he might lose today. He thought about what he'd gotten back. Then he got up and went to the children's room. The door was cracked open. Josie lay on her stomach hugging a pillow. Mr. Cloud tucked under her arm. Lily Rose lay on her side, Naomi's blonde doll pressed to her chest, her breathing soft and steady. Jonah was curled on the spare bed in the corner, his Spider-Man backpack still set right at the head of the mattress, as if he were always ready to leave at any moment, because he'd never stayed anywhere long enough to let go of that habit. Damon sat on the floor with his back against the wall and watched the 3 children sleep. He didn't pray. He didn't ask for a specific outcome. He only sat there grateful that this moment existed. A few minutes later, Lily Rose opened her eyes. She blinked at him in the dim early light slipping through the curtains, then asked in a drowsy voice, "Is it today, Daddy?" He didn't know how much she understood about what was happening. He'd never told the children about work, about the meeting, about the pressure. But children felt everything through skin thinner than adults. And Lily Rose felt it most. Yes, princess, it's today. She sat up on the bed, looking at him with blue-gray eyes, fully awake now. Don't be scared, Daddy. The words, the same words she'd whispered in her second prayer. Please don't let Daddy be scared. But this time she wasn't saying them to God. This time she was saying them straight to him. Damon felt warmth rise in his chest, the kind that didn't come from outside, but from a place deep inside that he'd thought had frozen to death a long time ago. I'm not scared, he said softly, and this time it was true. When he went down to the kitchen, Haley had coffee ready and was making breakfast. Jonah sat at the corner of the table drawing with crayons. So focused he didn't hear Damon's footsteps. Josie was trying to climb up into her high chair, legs kicking at the air. But what made Damon stop was the sheet of paper in the middle of the dining table, placed neatly beside the coffee mug Haley had just poured for him. A new drawing, not Josie's, Lily Rose's. He knew immediately, because Lily Rose's lines were always more careful, slower, each stroke considered before her crayon touched the page. The drawing showed two roads. On the left was a long, dark road, thick with tall rectangles colored black and gray, buildings without windows, without people, without light. On the right was a much shorter road, leading to a small house colored yellow, with a red triangular roof, beside a big tree colored green, and above it, a sky filled in blue, as far as the crayon would allow. Between the two roads stood a person. Not too big, not too small, just standing there facing the two choices. And at the end of the shorter road, two tiny figures were waving. Beneath the picture, in scribbly letters only someone used to reading a 3-year-old's handwriting could decode, Lily Rose had written, "Daddy picked this one." Damon held the drawing in both hands. He stared a long time, longer than it took to understand a child's crayon picture, because what he was reading wasn't a drawing. It was truth. Then he folded the paper carefully, smoothing each crease, and slid it into the inside pocket of the black suit jacket he'd wear to the meeting today. Before he left, he knelt in front of the 3 children. Josie, Lily Rose, and Jonah stood in a line, looking at him with 3 pairs of eyes carrying 3 different shades. Josie curious, Jonah timid, Lily Rose calm. "No matter what happens today," he said, his voice even, slow, each word clear, "I want you to know one thing. I've chosen what's most important." He stood up, walked to the door, and stopped in front of Haley. She stood by the kitchen counter, dish towel still in her hand, back a little straighter than usual, eyes fixed on him without blinking. For 2 years he'd always called her Miss Brennan, or Haley with a sir, or the polite distance of the man who paid her. But that morning he said only one word, Haley. Her name, nothing else. No honorific, no distance. Just her name in his mouth, for the first time sounding like the name of someone important, not a name on a payroll. She looked up. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His eyes had already said everything, his mouth wasn't ready to speak. And Haley, the woman who'd read pain in 2 little girls' faces for 2 years, read it all. Damon turned and walked out the front door. The black Range Rover was already running in the driveway. And just as he reached for the car door, small footsteps sounded behind him. He turned. Lily Rose stood on the front step, barefoot on cold stone, hair still messy from sleep, and she said in a clear voice that cut through the Chicago morning air, "Don't be scared, Daddy." Damon stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt longer than the last 2 years combined. Then he nodded, got into the car, and drove away with the drawing in the inside pocket of his jacket, resting over his left chest, right where his heart was. The meeting took place in the basement of an Italian restaurant in Chinatown, a place the Graves organization had used for off-the-books conversations for more than 20 years. The room had no windows, thick concrete walls, light from 2 dull yellow ceiling fixtures pooling over a long wooden table set in the center. 11 men sat around it. Regional bosses, Paulie Drennan from the west side of Chicago, the Kowalski brothers from Milwaukee, representatives from Detroit, from St. Louis, from Indianapolis. Reed Calloway sat to Damon's right, back straight, face blank, both hands resting on the table. Vince Talon sat across from Damon at the far head, relaxed like a man who already knew the outcome, or at least believed he did. No one made small talk. No one asked about anyone's health. In this world, when 11 men sat down at the same table at the same time, There was only one reason. Polly, the oldest and considered the most neutral, though neutral in a criminal organization only meant you hadn't picked a side out loud yet, ran the meeting. He kept it short. This meeting has been called by request to evaluate the current leadership structure of the organization. Before we proceed to a vote, does the current leader wish to speak? Every eye turned to Damon. He stayed still for 3 seconds, not because he hesitated, but because he wanted everyone in the room to see him clearly before he opened his mouth. Then he stood. No rush, no chair scraping. He just rose the way he rose every day, with the steadiness of a man who knew exactly where he was standing. For years, I believed leadership meant being available 24/7. It meant sacrificing everything, time, health, family, to prove I deserved that chair. He didn't look at Vince. He looked at each man slowly, from Polly to the Kowalskis to every face around the table. I've lived that way. I've built everything you're sitting here benefiting from that way, and I've paid for it with things none of you in this room have seen because I never allowed anyone to see them. The room went absolutely still. But I found out something. Success doesn't mean anything if you have to lose yourself to keep it. I almost lost my daughters, not because someone assassinated them, but because I wasn't there. And that's the kind of loss no money and no power can replace. He paused, letting the words settle into the thick air of the basement. If you believe my vision isn't right for this organization anymore, I'll accept that decision. But I won't pretend to be the man I'm not anymore. He sat back down. No drama, no pounding the table, no threats, just sitting and waiting. The silence stretched for about 10 seconds. 10 seconds where Damon felt every heartbeat in his chest, right where Lily Rose's drawing rested inside his suit. Then Reed stood. He didn't look at Damon. He looked straight at everyone around the table. I've worked for the Graves family since before most of you here knew how to hold a gun. I know what weak leadership looks like, and I know what leadership looks like when it's changing. This isn't weakness, and I support the model Damon proposed. One of the Kowalski brothers nodded. The Indianapolis representative, a younger man Damon had promoted 3 years earlier, said, "If a shared model gives regions more autonomy, I don't object." Polly looked around the table, reading each face. Vote. One by one, hands lifted, heads nodded, voices said a single word. Damon didn't count because he saw the result on Vince's face before Polly announced it. That face tightened, jaw grinding, eyes narrowing, his body still seated but coiled like a snake blocked from its path. "The result," Polly said evenly. "The majority agrees to keep Damon in the leadership position, on the condition that the shared operational model he proposed is implemented. Reed will assume the role of direct chief operating authority. The regions will have expanded decision rights within their assigned scope." A low murmur, a few nods. Vince didn't move. Damon didn't either. It wasn't a victory the old way. No enemy crushed. No absolute dominance. He kept his position not because he proved he was stronger than everyone, but because he proved he was consistent. And in a room full of men used to being lied to, consistency carried more weight than any threat. The meeting ended. Men filed out, some first, some after. Small groups thinning through the narrow staircase back to the restaurant above. Damon waited until almost everyone was gone. Then he walked to Vince, who still sat at the far end of the table, both hands clenched into fists on the wood. Damon stood beside him, not sitting, not pulling up a chair, only close enough that Vince had to look up at him. Damon spoke very softly, his voice dropping to a level only the two of them could hear. And in that voice there was no peace, not the peace he'd found in recent weeks. In that voice was the old Damon Graves, the version the city feared, the version who'd hunted the man who killed his wife and ended him with bare hands in a warehouse on the south side. "I know you had someone watching Haley." Vince went pale. Not much, just a shade, but enough for Damon to know he was right. Damon leaned closer, his mouth less than a handspan from Vince's ear. "Touch anyone in my house, and I'll remind you why they call me Graves." He let the words hang long enough for the double meaning to land. Graves was his name, but graves were also burial pits. Then he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the basement without looking back. When Damon drove out of Chinatown, the afternoon sun was dropping behind the downtown Chicago skyscrapers, staining the sky into a band of orange and red, stretching all the way to the Lake Michigan horizon. He drove slower than usual, not because he wasn't tired, though he was, but because for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to rush anywhere. The drawing was still in his suit pocket, right over his left chest. He felt it every time he took a deep breath, the thin paper pressing lightly against his skin through the fabric. A reminder that the most important thing he carried today wasn't the gun in the car compartment, wasn't the phone full of messages, but a crayon picture from a 3-year-old that said, "Daddy, pick this one." He parked in the garage and slipped into the house through the back door without announcing himself. Just like that morning, the morning he heard the prayer and everything started to change, laughter drifted from the kitchen. Not every laugh was one he could pick out immediately because they tangled together in a messy braid, high voices and low, quick snorts and full belly giggles, but he knew it was the sound of 3 children being happy, because nothing else in the world sounded like that. He stepped to the kitchen doorway and looked in. Haley stood in the middle of a battlefield of flour. She wore her old gray sweater, hair tied up high but loose strands had slipped free and stuck to white dust. Her apron covered in tiny handprints made of butter and sugar. On the black marble counter, flour was scattered like snow. Broken egg clung to the rim of a bowl. Sugar lay in small piles, and the 3 children stood on their high chairs around the counter, each holding a baking tool and none of them using it for what it was meant for. Josie held a small rolling pin and banged it against the counter like a drum. Lily Rose pressed a star cookie cutter against her own elbow and studied the imprint. Jonah, his face dusted with flour from forehead to chin, was trying to shape dough into a long snake, but it kept snapping in the middle, and he laughed every time it broke. Haley tried to direct all 3 at once, her voice both patient and cheerfully helpless. "No, Josie, the rolling pin isn't a drumstick." Lily Rose, "Don't press the cutter on your body." Jonah, "Add more flour if it breaks." Josie saw Damon first. She yelled, "Daddy," dropped the rolling pin to the floor, jumped down from her chair, and ran straight to him. 2 small hands coated in white flour wrapped around his leg. Then she looked up and smeared both hands across his black suit jacket, the jacket he'd worn to the meeting that decided the future of the entire empire, and now 2 bright flower handprints bloomed across his chest. Lily Rose came after her, not running but moving fast, and she hugged him from the other side, cheek pressed to his hip, flour falling from her hair onto his pants. Jonah stood on the chair, looking down, hesitant, still not used to getting close to Damon even though he'd been in this house for more than a week. But then he climbed down, walked over in small careful steps, and hugged Damon's leg from behind, lightly, like he was afraid of being pushed away. Damon stood there in the middle of the kitchen, his $1,000 suit coated in white from chest to knees, 3 children clinging to him like 3 tiny anchors, and he didn't move. Haley stood by the counter, still holding a wooden spoon streaked with dough, eyes slightly widened. "I'm sorry, sir. The kids got flour all over your clothes. I'll clean it right away." Damon looked at her. Then he laughed. Not the polite smile he wore at elite parties. Not the cold smile he used when he threatened someone. This was real laughter, rising from a place deep inside him that he'd thought he'd forgotten how to reach. Laughter that shook in his chest and spread to his mouth, narrowing his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years since Naomi died, Damon Graves laughed with his whole face. "This is perfect." Haley watched him laugh, and didn't say anything else. She just stood there, hand tight on the spoon, and on her mouth was something she'd held back for a long time, because she hadn't dared let it show in this house, a smile that wasn't a servant's smile, but the smile of someone who belonged here. That night there was no formal dinner at the long 6-seat oak table. Damon ordered pizza, the pepperoni and cheese kind Josie loved, and the 5 of them sat on the living room floor with their backs against the sofa, the open pizza box between a tangle of small feet, the television playing a cartoon Damon didn't know the name of, but Jonah could recite line for line. Josie got through half a slice before her head tipped onto Damon's shoulder, and she fell asleep, tomato sauce still on her mouth, her breathing soft and even. Lily Rose sat beside him, not asleep, but her hand held his and didn't let go. Tiny fingers wrapped around his index finger with a grip that was light but sure. Jonah curled up beside Haley, head on her knee, eyes half open and half closed, fighting sleep because he didn't want to miss the cartoon, but that skinny 9-year-old body wouldn't obey. Damon looked at the screen, but he wasn't watching the movie. He was watching the journey. The morning he stepped into the kitchen and heard the prayer, the sleepless night in the office full of guns and money, the drawing where he was tiny in the far corner, the call where he refused to go to New York, 48 hours of collapse, his father calling from Scottsdale, the second prayer, the darkest night in the garden, the 4-person breakfast table, Jonah's asthma attack at 2 in the morning, the superhero play, the leaked article, the basement meeting, and now this. The living room floor, cold pizza, a cartoon, 3 children asleep in pieces, and the woman sitting one child away, breathing evenly. Not perfect, not sparkling, no soundtrack, but real. 3 days after the vote, Reed called Damon at 6 o'clock in the morning. His voice wasn't rushed, wasn't panicked, but there was something heavier than usual underneath each word, the weight of a man about to deliver news he knew would change everything. Vince contacted the FBI. Reed spoke slowly, clearly, so Damon heard every syllable. My source in the police department confirmed it. Vince met with Agent Park twice this past week, at a hotel in Oak Brook, out in the suburbs, far enough that nobody in the organization would see. He's trading information for immunity. Damon sat on the edge of the bed, with the phone pressed to his ear, eyes fixed on the window where the Chicago sky was still dark. He wasn't surprised. Part of him had known for a long time that Vince wasn't the type to accept losing. He was the type who, if he couldn't sit in the chair, would burn the chair down. And when the vote didn't give him what he wanted, the next logical step was to sell the organization to the federal government and drag Damon down by a different road. "What is he giving them?" Damon asked. Reed went quiet for a second. Not all of it yet, but at minimum the financial structure of Graves Holdings, the list of shell companies, and possibly details about the shipping line through Newark. If Park gets enough from Vince combined with Kensington, the RICO case will be complete in a few months. Damon ended the call. He sat still for 2 minutes, not weighing what to do, because he already knew what to do. He was weighing whether he was still the kind of man who would do it, and the answer came faster than he wanted. Yes, because this wasn't about power or money anymore. Vince was bringing to his front door the only thing Damon couldn't allow: danger to the 3 children and the woman sleeping under this roof. If the RICO case took shape, the FBI would freeze every asset, seize the mansion, and the children would be dragged into a storm they didn't understand and didn't deserve. That afternoon, Vince Talon received a call from Reed, asking him to come to an address in an industrial pocket on the south side to discuss division of regional responsibilities under the new shared leadership model. Vince came because he thought it was a chance to grab more power inside the new structure, or at least to keep up the appearance of cooperation while he waited for the FBI to strike. When he stepped into the windowless room on the second floor of an old warehouse, Damon was already sitting there. 1 table, 2 chairs, 1 overhead light, no one else. Reed stood outside the door with his back against the wall, face blank. Nothing happened on paper after that door closed. No screaming, no gunshots, no description of violence. Only this. The meeting lasted 23 minutes, and after those 23 minutes, Vince Talon never appeared in any Graves organization meeting again. Nobody asked. In this world, when someone disappeared, the question wasn't what happened. It was, do I want to know? And the answer was always no. Special Agent Colleen Park realized her source went dark on day 3. By day 5, she knew Vince was gone. No body, no evidence, nothing to open a new file. And with Kensington only able to provide old information from years ago, the RICO case lost its main pillar. The investigation didn't die, but it lost momentum, lost direction, and Park knew it would take months, maybe years, to rebuild from the ground up. Damon didn't celebrate. He never celebrated things like that. He only went home, showered, changed clothes, and began accelerating what he'd been planning for weeks: gradual legalization of the empire, cutting away each illegal piece, shifting resources into licensed real estate and casinos, restructuring the finances so every dollar that flowed through Graves Holdings could survive sunlight. Not because he wanted to become a good man, because he wanted the children to grow up without carrying the Graves name like a sentence. That night, after the children were asleep, Damon went out into the garden. October air had turned truly cold, his breath making a thin smoke under the garden lights. He sat down on the white iron chair beneath the oak tree and realized Haley was already there, in the chair across from him, both hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, her sweater pulled up to her chin. She looked at him when he sat, but she didn't ask about work, didn't ask about the meeting, didn't ask about anything that belonged to the world on the other side of the mansion door. She only sat there, and her silent presence was enough. Damon looked at the Chicago night sky, then at her, and he said, "Thank you." Haley tilted her head slightly. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Graves. You prayed when I didn't know I was lost." Haley lowered the tea to her lap, her eyes meeting his through the steam rising from the mug, and she said as softly as wind, "The kids love you so much." Damon nodded slowly. Then he said 2 words he'd spoken many times in his life but had never truly felt until this moment. Sitting in a cold garden in the middle of a Chicago night, facing the woman who'd kept his family from breaking apart with roughened hands and prayers. Me too. And for the first time, those 2 words weren't duty, weren't reflex, weren't a line a father said because he knew he was supposed to say it. They were truth. Simple, bare, and real. The weeks that followed had no headlines, no dark basements, no votes, only repetition. And inside that repetition was the real miracle. Damon learned how to lead with limits, something no one in the Graves bloodline had ever considered possible. He came home before 6 o'clock every day. Not sometimes, every day. He delegated all direct operations to Reed, and he didn't call to check in the middle of the night the way he used to. Didn't demand a report on every detail. Didn't hover over every small decision. He trusted, and for a man who'd lived 20 years on suspicion, trust was a braver act than any purge. Every night he read stories to Josie and Lily Rose before bed. Not the kind of reading you rush through to be done, but sitting between 2 small beds, with the book open on his lap, his voice changing with each character. Low when he played Papa Bear, high when he played the baby bunny, and Josie always made him read the last page again, because she loved the happy ending. Jonah sat at the foot of the bed listening too, a 9-year-old pretending he was too old for bedtime stories, but his eyes never left the page. One Saturday afternoon, Damon brought home 2 small bicycles with training wheels. Josie charged in immediately, fearless and eager, wobbling across the backyard grass, her high laughter bursting out every time the bike tilted. Lily Rose was more careful, pedaling slowly, controlling each rotation, and Damon walked beside her with one hand on the back of her seat, ready to catch her but not catching her unless he had to. Jonah ran behind them cheering. Haley stood on the back steps watching, one hand pressed to her chest like she was holding something she couldn't bear to drop. Then Josie fell. The bike tipped left as she pedaled over a soft patch of dirt near the oak tree. The front wheel sank, and she rolled into the grass. Her right knee scraped open, a small bloom of blood on pale skin, and Josie sat up and stared at the wound, her face pinching. Then she cried, not loudly, but the held-in kind of crying, tears running while she tried not to make a sound. The kind of crying a child learns when she's used to nobody coming when she cries. Damon was there in 3 seconds. He dropped to his knees, lifted Josie, and settled her on his lap. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and gently wiped the scrape, and she looked at him with wet eyes that were already starting to calm, because Daddy was here, and Daddy was cleaning her knee instead of calling someone else to do it. Falling doesn't mean you can't do it, he said, his voice steady and warm, each word placed as gently as the bandage he pressed to his daughter's skin. Josie looked at him, tears still caught on her lashes, and she said something he wasn't ready to hear. Daddy, you fell too. 3 words. From a 3-year-old mouth, but Damon heard 2 years inside them, an empire nearly collapsing, a vote to remove him. The darkest night in the garden when he'd thought about quitting. The cold call from his father. His daughter's prayer asking God not to let Daddy be scared. The $1,000 suit covered in white flour. He fell. He fell many times. Yes, he said, his voice a little rough. But Daddy got back up. Josie nodded, serious, like it was the only answer she needed. Then she slid off his lap, went back to the bicycle lying on its side in the grass, lifted it up by herself, climbed onto the seat, and pedaled away. This time she made it a few more meters before the bike started to wobble. But she didn't fall. Damon stood watching his daughter ride farther across the lawn and understood she wasn't only learning how to ride a bicycle. They were learning by watching him. The way he fell, the way he stood back up, the way he chose to stay. Every action was a lesson they would remember deeper than any bedtime story, and that responsibility was bigger than any $1 million contract he'd ever signed. A few days later, on a rainy November afternoon, when water slid down the living room windows in long lines, Lily Rose walked over to Damon where he sat on the sofa reading documents. She held out a sheet of paper with both hands, solemn as if she were handing him something precious. Damon took the drawing, and he looked. No more 2 roads. No more dark buildings on the left and a small house on the right. No more figure standing in the middle forced to choose. There was only one house, colored a warm yellow, a red triangular roof, a wide open front door, a big tree beside it with a thick green canopy, a wide blue sky filling half the page, and a bright yellow sun in the corner. Beneath it, in letters steadier than the first drawing, Lily Rose had written, "Daddy always comes home." Damon held the picture in both hands and felt his chest fill with something he couldn't find a word for. Not pride, not relief, meaning, the feeling that his life, for the first time, was moving toward the place it was supposed to go. That night, after the 3 children fell asleep, and the mansion sank into the kind of quiet Damon used to fear but was starting to get used to, he stepped out into the garden. The Chicago skyline shimmered in the distance, Willis Tower blazing, the buildings along Lake Michigan glittering like a galaxy laid sideways, and the November wind carried the first bite of winter as it slid through the oak tree whose leaves had begun to fall. Haley was already there, sitting on the familiar white iron chair, both hands wrapped around her mug of tea, eyes turned toward the horizon but not truly seeing it, the look of someone thinking about things that lived deeper than sight. Damon sat down in the chair beside her. Not the chair across from her like the other times. Beside, closer, close enough that he could hear her breathing, close enough that when the wind lifted, his shoulder nearly brushed hers. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy, it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who'd shared enough that they didn't need to fill every gap with words. Then Damon spoke, his voice low and slow, each word like a footstep on thin ice, because he knew once he said it, he couldn't take it back. "I don't deserve you." Haley turned to look at him. Not surprised, not shocked, as if she'd heard this coming from far away long before he spoke. From every glance he held a second too long, from the way he'd said her name the morning before the vote, from the way he'd carried Jonah to the hospital at 2 a.m. without anyone asking. "You don't get to decide that for me." Her voice didn't tremble, didn't soften. It was simply clear and steady in the way of someone who'd lived through enough hardship to know what she wanted. Damon looked at her, and in his eyes was something Haley had never seen in 2 years in this house. Fear. Not fear of enemies or fear of losing power, but fear that he'd hurt the woman sitting in front of him. "My world is dangerous." Haley set her tea on the iron table, turned fully toward him, and spoke each word like she was placing bricks, building something she'd been thinking about for a long time. "I've been in your world for a long time already. I know who you are. I know what this house holds. I know about the Beretta on your desk. I know about the midnight calls. I know Reed isn't just an assistant. I know it all, and I choose to stay." Damon didn't answer with words. He reached out slowly, as if he was afraid she'd pull away, and placed his hand over hers on the iron armrest. His hand was big, rough, marked with small scars from years he'd never speak about. A hand that had held guns, signed sentences with no paper, ended other people's lives in dark warehouses, and that hand was trembling. Haley looked down at his hand on hers. She didn't pull back. She didn't say more. She only turned her palm up so her hand met his palm, and her fingers closed around his gently but firmly. The Chicago night was cold, but the distance between them, the distance that for 2 years had been held in place by honorifics, by boundaries of employer and housekeeper, by fear and restraint, that distance was finally filled. Not with a kiss, with the choice to stay beside each other. That Sunday, they held a picnic in the garden, nothing fancy. Sandwiches Haley and Jonah made together in the kitchen that morning, pressed juice, cut fruit in a plastic container, and an old blanket spread on the grass under the oak tree. The 3 children chased each other around the yard, Josie screaming with joy, Lily Rose running slower but laughing louder, Jonah leading with the long legs of a 9-year-old boy, the 3 voices braiding together and filling a garden that used to hold only wind and silence. Haley sat beneath the oak, knees drawn up, back against the trunk, her face peaceful in a way Damon had never seen since the day she entered this house. Damon sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and he said, "What if you hadn't prayed with them that day?" Haley turned and gave a small smile, not showy, but warm from within. "You'd still be here. You just needed someone to help you hear it." The words hung in the warm Sunday air. Sometimes we aren't physically absent, we're emotionally absent, and all we have to do is stop long enough to listen. That night, after the picnic ended, and the children were bathed clean, Damon sat between 2 small beds reading stories like every night. Josie fell asleep before he finished page 3. Jonah went back to his own room. Lily Rose lay on her side, Naomi's blonde doll pressed to her chest, eyes half closed. Damon stood, pulled the blanket up around her, and as he bent to kiss her forehead, Lily Rose whispered in a half-asleep voice, light as breath, "Daddy, you're not lost anymore." Damon kept his lips on her forehead one more second. Then he whispered back, no louder than her breathing, but each word carrying the weight of 2 years of pain, of being lost, of finding the way home. Not anymore. He didn't promise perfection. He didn't promise he'd never get it wrong. He promised awareness. He promised effort. He promised that every day he'd wake up and choose again. Choose to stay. Choose to be present. Choose to come home. And before this story ends, I want to tell you something. Maybe you're building something big too. Maybe you're fighting every day for stability, for a future, for the people you love, and that isn't wrong. But ask yourself, who is waiting for you to come home? Who is whispering in silence, hoping you'll be present? Because time doesn't shout. Time whispers, and when it decides to leave, it doesn't come back. Damon didn't change because he failed. He changed because he listened, and listening saved his life before it saved his empire. Real success doesn't make headlines. It makes legacy. It lives in a child's eyes when she knows Daddy will come home. It lives in the trembling hand of the strongest man finally daring to hold the hand of the woman he loves. It lives in a crayon drawing that says Daddy always comes home. The miracle isn't that everything changes outside. The miracle is when you decide to change inside. And that's the kind of victory that can change an entire generation. If this story touched something inside you, I want you to hit the like button, share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories every day. I really want to know how you felt after this story. Did it remind you of someone in real life? Was there a moment that made you stop and think? Leave a comment below and share what you feel from the deepest part of your heart, because your story deserves to be heard too. Thank you for staying until the end of the video. I wish you and the people you love good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.